tell us how atheism is or could be a gateway drug to the gospel, or how reading Dawkins could lead people. How did that happen in the case of some of the 12 people that you have included in the book?
Well, I think there's a common pattern between all these authors, and it goes like this. We began by reading Dawkins and felt this makes sense. This is really intelligent. This is the way the cultural zeitgeist is moving. We're in. And then as they read him more closely, feeling some gaps here, there's some problems here, there's some questions he's not addressing, there's some issues he's trying to suppress. And gradually beginning to think, well, look, Dawkins is very, very critical of Christianity. Maybe we need to read some Christian writers like C.S. Lewis. And as they began this process of exploration, they began to realize that actually Dawkins was not right in what he said about Christianity. Dawkins was not persuasive about his own views of reality. And actually Christianity offered a much better account. And so in effect, you have a transition from Dawkins to faith, which I think is remarkable, because these people in effect were questing. They were looking for something that really satisfied and thought they had found it, and then realized they had not, and began in honesty to say, let's look beyond this and see what else there is. And so came to Christianity. So the point is, each of these writers is telling their stories in their own distinct ways. And the common theme is, in effect, Dawkins is a gateway to faith, not because Dawkins is an evangelist, because Dawkins helps to see the vulnerability of atheism and the need for something that's better.
So he might have been more effective if he kept his mouth shut.
Well, we'll see what people think about that. But the key point is, for a lot of people, Dawkins does not satisfy. It makes them want something better, and they find it in Christianity. So the key takeaway message is, you may have people who at this moment think Dawkins is wonderful, but that's a vulnerable position. It may change. And the key point is we need to talk about Christianity and show why it makes sense and why it has so much to say about the questions that Dawkins can't really answer.
What do you say in The Twilight of Atheism and in the Dawkins Delusion, in those books? What led you to write The Twilight of Atheism? Let's start there.
What led me to write that book was my feeling that atheism didn't really stand for anything. And in many ways, its high profile was not so much about the quality of its intellectual arguments as its hostility towards religion. In other words, it was a reaction against something rather than a commendation of something positive. And so the way I end that book is that in many ways, it all depends on what happens next as to where atheism goes. And then, of course, we have 9/11. And that really does change the intellectual landscape. And that's when people like Dawkins and Hitchens and Sam Harris begin to really rise to prominence. But you see, we're past that now. And people are beginning to say, look, that was simply a blip, a kind of a transient moment. And we're now rethinking things in a radical way, and we've left the new atheism behind us.
But let's go back to 9/11. What was it about 9/11 that led to the rise of the new atheism, so-called?
Well, many people would say that in many ways, the 9/11 was a reflection of American foreign policy. Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris all said, no, it's because of the nature of religion. 9/11 shows that religious people are mad. They are willing to kill people to promote their own ends. They're lunatics. Is that the kind of person you want to be or you want to know? So if you like, they redirected 9/11 to, in effect, being a critique of religious belief.
And so you're saying that led to the rise of the so-called new atheism, but it didn't last. It was not...
Well, I think for a while the new atheism was eminently plausible because people were suspicious of religion. They wanted a kind of intellectual justification for what was very often simply a cultural dislike of religion. And for a while that seemed to be right. And then people began to realize, well, what is actually the evidence for atheism? Where actually are Dawkins and Hitchens and others coming from? And began to realize, actually, this is simply one belief against another belief. They could not prove their atheism. And so, if you like, there was a growing criticism of this this movement because it did not seem to be able to, A, give a coherent critique of its alternatives, namely Christianity, and B, it seemed to have a very, very inadequate positive message to articulate. Why is atheism important? Well, that remains a very, very good question, but they didn't answer it. And so if you like, what happened is the new atheist movement began to fragment, it began to lose cultural traction, and above all, I think, that it began to seem to be, in effect, the personal views of a number of people being projected as if these were infallible authors talking to the public. And very often I'll make the point to my new atheist friends that, in effect, the new atheism is a kind of form of religion because it has infallible texts and infallible authors. And you can see immediately what's going on there.
One of the most patently preposterous claims of some of the new atheists, but to Dawkins in particular, it can be summed up in the term positivism, I guess. The idea, well, talk a little bit about what is positivism, what does that mean?
Well, positivism is the idea that you don't need faith. There are certain things that are just obviously right. And so very often Dawkins will say, I don't need to defend my views because they're so obviously right, and therefore I go to critique other people's views. And if you like, there's a kind of intellectual asymmetry here. What I mean by that is Dawkins is saying, my views are so obviously right, I don't need to defend them, whereas you, religious people, you need to defend your views because they're so obviously wrong. But again, you can see, well, surely Dawkins is using criteria to judge other people's views that he's not using to judge his own views. And if you read, for example, Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, or Christopher Hitchens' book, God's Not Great, they are full of moral and intellectual beliefs which are not justified. People began to notice that and think, I wonder if these guys are in effect simply people of faith who haven't recognized they are people of faith, not absolute security.
And Dawkins says, and I think this is part of what positivism is, that you can only know anything via science, which is, as I said earlier, manifestly ridiculous, but he somehow maintains that as though anything outside of scientific knowledge is either unknowable or non-existent.
Well, that's right, and it's a real problem, because if you're saying science is the only valid criterion, the only valid form of knowledge, then you have to recognize the fact that it's actually not so much as scientific as a philosophical position. And so if you're saying only science can tell us what is right, then what I want to know is, how can science tell us that the belief that only science gives us reliable knowledge is right? And of course it can't. You can't do an experiment to sort that out. It's a belief system. And that really is where Dawkins began to experience some quite difficult questions being asked about him. Namely, how can you show that science is right and that science alone is able to give us answers to questions about life? And the real problem, I think, is that Dawkins is able to show science is very, very good at telling us how the universe functions. When you come to deep existential questions like what does the universe mean or what is the universe all about, he can only say, well, science can't answer that question, and so draws the conclusion there is no meaning to life at all. That's simply a limitation on the part of his message. So it's a very important point to make, I think.
You are a man of science yourself. When you first came to faith, were you concerned about scientific objections to faith? Did you yourself have troubling questions? Because there is the implication, it's been out there for a little while, that science is at odds with faith. I know that that's actually the opposite is the case. But when you were a young man, how did you approach that?
Well, I think that's a very good question, because certainly I experienced those questions. I'm a scientist, I'm now a Christian. How do I hold these things together? And my Christian friends would say, well, look, all truth is God's truth. There isn't really a problem. I wanted a better answer than that. And then I happened to go to a sermon at my college chapel here in Oxford, in Wadham College as it happens. And I heard a sermon by Professor Charles Coulson, who was Oxford's professor of theoretical chemistry and a very well-known Methodist lay preacher. And he preached a sermon on how you could hold science and faith together. And that just was like someone turning a light on. I suddenly saw, this is right, this works. And in fact, my whole career ever since there has simply been expanding what Charles Coulson said in that sermon that night. Because in many ways, what Coulson was saying is that science and religion are in effect different perspectives on life. And that doesn't mean they're in conflict. It means that we need these different perspectives to make sense of the complexities of life. And I think that's a very important point, and certainly something I've been following through ever since.
I mean, although it seems that we can go further now because of, the fine-tuned universe. Fine-tuning to me is the ultimate problem for atheists. What do you make of the outrageous fine-tuning, what looks like fine-tuning in design? And over the decades, there's been more and more and more of that, to the point that I think that atheists they're in real trouble over it.
Well, that's right. Back in the early 1970s, when I was discovering faith, that wasn't really being talked about very much. But you're quite right, it now is in a very big way. And you might say, well, look, there is this phenomenon of fine-tuning. It's just an accident, just a coincidence. It's not significant. But the problem is that actually it is very, very significant. And the question is, what's the best way of making sense of it? And as you were hinting, the best way of doing this is to say, this is exactly what you would expect if Christianity is right. In other words, it doesn't prove Christianity, but it's precisely what you would expect if Christianity is true.